everyone, welcome back to Miss Bray's World History Survival Skills. Today we are going to be learning about how to mark up or annotate a text, and this is a skill that we will be using in class tomorrow. So how to mark up a text. As you're reading, you're pausing and simultaneously doing the three things listed here. You're circling words that you don't know or you're not sure about. You're underlining or highlighting sentences that help you answer your questions, make you think, or that you have questions about. You're also writing down any questions or comments or connections that are arising from the text. It's great to underline and highlight things, but as much as possible, you should be making notes as to why you highlighted or underlined those. So when you look back, you don't have to sit there and think about it. It's just right there in front of you. Now, as people get more and more versed at marking up text and as they practice it more and more, most people tend to come up with their own key, so their own little symbols so that they know when they look back at their text what they mean. So just as an example, here are a few of mine. I always, of course, use the underline. If something's extra important, I will sometimes use the squiggly underline, or if I feel like I'm underlining a lot of things, then sometimes I'll just switch it up if my thought process is changing, or if a new idea is something I'm underlining. I also use arrows all the time. I use exclamation marks if I think that something is important. A star with a circle usually means that I think it's something that I will definitely need to go back to at a later time. Sometimes, if I have the double exclamation mark with the star, means that that section right there is probably answering one of the key questions that I'm looking for. I also use a lot of question marks, sometimes several question marks in a row if I'm very confused. Something else I use a lot is a bracket. So if there's a whole concept that I feel connected to something else in the text, or if I want to write about, I'll do the bracket and then I'll do an arrow to something else that was happening in the text, or I'll do an arrow and I can write down my own notes or my own comments about that. But then I know I'm circling that whole idea and I don't have to sit there and underline, 5 to 10 lines. Again, people tend to come up with what works for them. So as you practice and you get better at marking up and annotating your texts, you will eventually develop your own reminders and your own key. So in this class, we're usually provided with guiding questions that allow us to focus our thought as we move through a text. So these 4 here are going to be the guiding questions for the example tonight, as well as for the text we'll be reading through tomorrow. So number 1, what stood out to you the most about each perspective? Number 2, what is one level 1 question you wrote down? Remember, level 1 question is going to be a content-based question. So I don't understand what this section means, or what does this vocabulary word mean? Number 3, what is one level 2 question you wrote down? So remember, a level 2 question is something that makes us think a little bit more. The answer might not be right there, easily found. There might not actually be a correct answer. It's just something that promotes thought, usually who, what, when, where, why, how type of questions. Number 4, how do these 2 perspectives better help you understand the story of power and slavery within our unit? So overall, how do these texts help you with your understanding? So now that we have our guiding questions, let's take a look at the resource that we will be using tomorrow. So this is the very first page of one of the sources we will be reading and marking up in class tomorrow. So remember, especially in a history course, the very first thing we do is we look at where this source came from. So if we zoom in on this information, we can see that the author is Equiano, who we know from class is an African male who was taken at the age of 11 and put on board a slave ship bound for the Americas. So since this was written by him, we know, and he was alive during that time, we know that this was a primary source. And if we look at the article title, life on board, so we know that's what this is going to be about. And then name of website. So remember, we're always extra careful about the reliability and credibility of websites. So the history of the transatlantic slave trade, published by the International Slavery Museum. So since it's an international museum, we can assume that it is both reliable and credible. And I'm writing this on here so that later when I have to do my annotations, I am able to very clearly see the information I need to write my annotated bibliography. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom this back out here so we can see the whole piece, and I'm going to model what it looks like to annotate your text. Now, while in class, you'll be expected to annotate as you read the entire thing. For the purpose of this modeling, I'm going to go ahead and start a couple of paragraphs down. I asked them if we were not to be eaten by those white men with horrible looks, red faces, and loose hair. They told me I was not. So I know they are the slaves, and this was interesting, the whole being eaten by the white men with these horrible looks, because this actually reminds me of something I read earlier about the world of bad spirits and just this idea of superstition and not really knowing what's going on, just having all these questions and trying to explain them. But still I feared I should be put to death. The white people looked and acted, as I thought, in so savage a manner, for I had never seen among any people such instances of brutal cruelty. Now this is really interesting. I'm going to go ahead and put a star with an exclamation point next to that because I think that'll be able to help me answer one of my guided questions. Just the idea that this word savage that we've used or learned so far about with Native Americans and Africans is actually being used here to describe white people. And this is the first time any of our texts have done that. So I'm just going to write here so I can find it later. African perspective. For I had never seen among any people such instances of brutal cruelty, and this not only shown toward us blacks, but also to some of the white themselves. One white man in particular I saw flogged so unmercifully with a large rope near the foremast that he died in consequence of it, and they tossed him over the side as they would have done a brute. There's a few things I want to make note of here. One, I'm not really sure what a foremast is, and I'm not really sure I completely understand what flogging is. I think I'd like to look up more specifically. I kind of have an idea, but I want to clarify that. What I thought was interesting about this whole chunk here, I'm going to move this so I have some room to write, but they're treating this white man the same as these black men. We've seen cruelty towards the Africans, but here they're also showing it towards white people. So are they not necessarily racist? Is their cruelty just more of a power thing? So I think this is important and might be really important for one of those guiding questions, maybe the one about the whole story of slavery in this time period. So hopefully you were able to follow along and kind of see what my thought process was while I read through the text and how I was able to jot down notes about that thought process. So now when I'm writing my paper and I want to use this as a source, I'm able to refer back to it and see what my thinking was and see what pieces were important or maybe what pieces I need to clarify a little bit more. And again, I'm doing this on the iPad, so yours will probably look a little bit neater. You'll be able to fit it all on the page. But this should give you the general idea. And something to keep in mind is if you can't fit something on the page, if you end up having a really important section that you want to talk about, sticky notes are great for this. Now, in the past, I've had several students get through a text and they'll have nothing written on it, and I ask them, well, what were your thoughts? And they tell me they didn't have any. And I find it hard to believe, reading the text where they're talking about torturing and murdering people, that no thoughts at all crossed their mind. But it's hard sometimes to really stop and think about them. So here are some tips. If you feel like you're just not coming up with anything, try and do these things. So pause after about 3 sentences. At the most, pause after 1 paragraph. And think about, is there anything that you didn't understand or want to clarify in that paragraph? It can be context, it can be vocabulary, anything at all, and then just write it down. Do you have any thoughts or comments about what you just read? Any connections, anything that you can make to your own life, to something else that we've read, to something that you read earlier in the text? And then lastly, is there anything you read that can help you answer one of those guiding questions? If you really can't think of anything at all, bring those questions back up, look at them again, and then return back to the text. That concludes today's tutorial. Thank you very much for listening, and I am excited to practice these skills in class tomorrow, as well as have some really great discussion around these questions. One last thing, just if you're interested, I'd had a few questions in various classes ask about how to access the crash courses that we sometimes watch clips of or that we reference in history. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull up a new browser here. And go ahead and go to YouTube. And once that gets pulled up, you can see that I've obviously watched a few of them recently. But go to the search button, and if you type in just crash course, they do quite a few different ones. So if you type in crash course, and if you just go to Crash Course World History, you are then able to scroll through their whole catalog. If, however, you want something more specific, you can ask what a good keyword would be, or here we can see that I've recently done World History Slave Trade, which is what we'll be talking about next week. And so if you go ahead and click on that, should be the first one that pops up. You can see they also have another one about slavery on it, but the Atlantic slave trade is the one we're looking for this week. And you go ahead and click on it there, and
Hi, my name is John.
it will go ahead and pop up. Okay, so if you get a chance, definitely watch it. It'll give you a really good context for what we're doing this next week. If you don't have time, there may be some time at the end of the week if you need to review anything. Okay, thank you. See you tomorrow.